Us, representatives of the 182nd District in the Pennsylvania General Assembly. Brian, always good to see you. Welcome to the show.
It's always good to be with you, David. Thank you so much for having me.
So can you tell us a little bit about this sign you have in the background?
What sign are you talking about? Just about 13 months ago, a little over 13 months ago now, I announced that I am running for lieutenant governor here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania after 10 years representing Center City, Philadelphia in the House of Representatives.
So you have some really big shoes to fill. And by that, I'm referring to Lieutenant Governor Fetterman. And not just because he wears what, size 15 or 16, because he has put forward or attempted to put forward quite a progressive agenda. So when elected to Lieutenant Governor, what will be your key priorities as you're leading the state Senate?
Thank you for asking. We'll talk, I'm sure, a little bit about the specific job duties of our lieutenant governor. That our lieutenant governor has a very specific set of job duties that are not a shadow of the governor or sort of ceremonial position. And we've seen, as you just pointed out from Lieutenant Governor Fetterman, that the reach, the impact, the policy impact, especially of a lieutenant governor, can extend beyond just those roles. And in my case, my career has been really built fighting for equality, women's rights, reproductive rights, racial and ethnic justice, LGBTQ plus civil rights. And all of those issues are still both on the chopping block in our legislature on a day-to-day basis. And we are far from legal equality in any of those areas in Pennsylvania. And so my hope and my intention is over the next 4 years, if elected lieutenant governor, that aside from chairing the Board of Pardons and the Emergency Management Council and being the president of the Senate, that I'll have a lot of opportunities to help fight back against the anti-equality narrative that's been so aggressive here in Pennsylvania.
So the anti-equality movement, you touched on a pretty fine point that has affected both of us dearly, and that is over the last, gosh, it feels like nearly 2 decades, we've been fighting for the Fairness Act, or some equivalent there too, House Bill 300. Representative Dan Frankel introduced that, Chairman Frankel, and Governor Wolf and you and I had the pleasure of meeting over the summer to get the Fairness Act on the table for the State Government Committee. Where do we stand with that, and what can we expect?
So for those people that don't know, and I'm guessing a lot of your viewers do know, every single state and the federal government protect certain categories of people from certain types of discrimination. And we actually know them. They seem to be sort of like a part of the fabric of our rights. You're protected from discrimination in areas of housing, employment, what we call public accommodations, places you can just go as a member of the public, oftentimes in education or in insurance. And the categories are race, religion, nationality, ethnicity, oftentimes disability, sometimes gender, rarely sexual orientation or gender identity, and certainly not in Pennsylvania. These bills grew out of the early ethnic intimidation acts of the 1950s and early 1960s. And as categories were added to them, they became the Human Relations Act. In Pennsylvania, as you just pointed out, we've been fighting now for the better part of, I believe, 18 years to amend the Human Relations Act to add sexual orientation and gender identity, both real or perceived. Now, we used to call it HB 300, and then we called it the Equality Act, the Pennsylvania Fairness Act. We're back to actually having HB 300, House Bill 300 as the call number for the bill again. Here's the way I always explain this bill to people. Pennsylvania is the last great gerrymandered state left in the United States. Most people understand gerrymandering is when you let a particular political party draw the maps or the districts of representation. They can do so in a way that falsely inflates their numbers and gives them more power than a truly representative democracy would dictate or demand. That's the case in Pennsylvania. There are about 650,000 more registered Democrats in the state than Republicans. But Republicans control our General Assembly, both House and Senate, as though they had about a 1.6 million vote lead over Democrats, which they don't. Now, David, if you and I were to gerrymander a state and falsely take control of a region, you'd think that we would find some of the issues of the people we stole that control from that we agreed upon, and we would work on those issues as a sort of way to pacify the people we had stolen control from. But that's not what our Republicans have done in Pennsylvania. What the social and political science tells us is that they have doubled down on the hardest line, the sort of most heinous side of Republican politics. It's why we see attacks on trans kids or trans people using bathrooms or locker rooms or these 6 and 8 week abortion bans. Ultimately, it's not that Pennsylvanians don't believe in LGBTQ equality. And I'm always so careful to make sure that everybody understands that we do. In Pennsylvania, a majority of Pennsylvanians, even a majority of Republicans, support including LGBTQ plus people in our civil rights protections. It is the Republican leadership, based on their gerrymander, that has completely stopped this issue and a number of issues that are supported by the majority of Pennsylvanians. Raising the minimum wage, equal pay, education funding, a better environmental protection. Those are all sort of key issues that a majority of people in the Commonwealth support, that our legislature would have you believe are radical ideas from a small minority.
And to that end, the way in which we're going about getting the Fairness Act passed, I think you summarized it very clearly. And the case that you've made for people who've never heard of the act, or who believe in equality, but they're just not sure what the real problem in Harrisburg is, I think you summarized that quite eloquently. Now, there is another matter dealing with equity that some people, especially people in my age bracket and older, are concerned about, are school property taxes. And apparently there's this bill, House Bill 13, calling for the elimination of school property taxes. Is that a fair bill, or what's your stand on it?
You know, I don't think it's a fair bill. And to be very clear here, we are eventually going to find a better middle ground in Pennsylvania for how and why seniors are sort of taxed out of their own homes. This is a complicated problem, and I'm going to try to be really clear about it. First of all, property taxes for education are appropriate, whether you have children or not. Every one of us benefits from living in and having an educated society. A rising tide does, in fact, lift all boats. Our country is proof of that. What's happened, though, is that people who don't want to be paying property tax, which is a lot of people don't want to pay taxes, have decided that this one particular tax is like the unfair tax that people are having that they shouldn't be paying. Now, here's the thing. If we actually had a severance tax in Pennsylvania, for example, we could just pass the lowest severance tax anywhere in the United States, in Pennsylvania. And that money that we would make, we could use that to put a property tax freeze on all seniors in Pennsylvania for all time. That's a real, we could close the tax loophole that we have with New Jersey and Delaware and Ohio and New York. And that is that we have a corporate net income tax that is one of the highest in the country. But because of it, only about 29% of Pennsylvania businesses are paying it. The rest have figured out ways to pay our neighbors at a lower tax rate. We need to switch to a commercial activity tax like other states have done and tax all of the commercial activity tax of 100% of those businesses. We could lower that rate way down for those people that are already paying it, and we could put a property tax freeze for seniors. The way that we have sort of leaned in on this as the unfair tax that people are having to pay is in part because also when you hear about Republicans at the statewide level saying that they are reducing taxes, what they are often, practically what they've always done, is lower tax rates at the statewide level, knowing that municipalities will have to pick up the slack locally to be able to pay for basic services. It's why so many Pennsylvania's towns don't have their own police force. And it's why, again, we are the state in the United States that has the most disparate funding between well-funded and poorly funded school districts.
And now to that end, I know up in the city and county of Erie, a number of people up that way are blaming the fact that there are either so many nonprofit organizations or tax exempt buildings that aren't paying property taxes, to the point that roughly 40% of the city of Erie isn't taxed that way just because of their tax status. So the neighbors up there are complaining they're paying a higher millage, a higher tax rate, solely because they have to pick up the burden, especially from companies like Scott Enterprises that controls a lot of the area along the Lake Erie shore, and the area that is run by things like hotels and casinos. Now, do you think it would be fair to change the tax code such that those entities wouldn't be allowed to get the types of tax breaks that cities and county governments have been offering?
Absolutely, yes. Frankly, Pittsburgh is as much an argument for this as anywhere else in the state. You know, I'm a civil rights attorney. I believe deeply in public interest and public policy work and nonprofit work, but I also, I'm an attorney, and I know that people will try to take advantage of systems that aren't designed to be defended against from them. And I think what we've seen is that people have taken economic advantage of systems that were set up to protect or proliferate arts, entertainment, medicine, and we're seeing it now done in a way to the tax disadvantage of actual taxpayers. You know, Pennsylvania already has problems with our uniformity clause and how we're able to tax businesses and how we're able to tax landowners who are individuals versus businesses. But now to allow essentially corporations that can have really large law firms working with them or huge accounting departments working with them to be able to take advantage of what we all collectively thought was the best interest of all community to allow certain tax, pardon me, tax breaks or tax advantages to then be used against the community. It's just nefarious.
Okay, so help me to understand this. If counties like Erie and Allegheny are struggling with their property taxes, what are we going to do with counties like Potter County or Forest County, where there just simply aren't that many people?
Yeah.
I mean, how do we bring quality education to rural counties in Pennsylvania?
The good news is, David, we don't have to guess. You and I, neither of us are academic experts with respect to the provision of education, but we don't have to guess. We don't even have to go look very far to figure out how this is done. And in fact, almost every single one of our neighbors has been doing this for far longer than we've been trying to. And here's what I mean by that. Every single state in the United States has some degree of a fair funding formula, what they're called. We actually were one of just the few states in the country for the longest time that didn't have a fair funding formula. And what a fair funding formula does is exactly what it sounds like it does. It makes sure that somebody from a poor county and somebody from a rich county don't get a different education. And what we all collectively agree, and is a part of our Constitution, should not be the case. Your zip code in Pennsylvania should not dictate the quality of your public education. And so here's how this works. And we're going to step out of Pennsylvania, just use a completely different state as an example. We'll pick California. You have Orange County, one of the highest tax bases, one of the wealthiest tax bases in America. And you have Oakland, one of the poorest tax bases in all of America. And so in Oakland, even if they had the exact same tax rate for education, we're going to say it's 5%. In Oakland, 5% doesn't generate nearly enough to pay for the students that are there. 5% in Orange County is more money than they could possibly need. And so what happens is the state decides per student, by and large, what does it take in public education to educate a student? We'll say $20,000. So if in Oakland, they're only able to raise locally $5,000 per student, the state steps in with that other $15,000. In Orange County, if they're raising $18,000 per student, the state will step in with just $2,000. The fair funding formula is applied, and the education that's delivered at the public level is equal across the state. In Pennsylvania, we didn't do this. First, we refused to have a fair funding formula. And the number one indicator of whether or not a school district was well funded or not for the longest time was whether or not their local senator or rep was in some degree of leadership. That was the metric that was most closely tied to it. It is heavily, of course, tied to our wealthy suburbs as well, but that's also where a lot of the leadership came from both parties. We finally did spend millions of dollars to develop a fair funding formula, I want to say 5 or 6 years ago. And then what our legislature required us to do is only apply it to new funding. So all the unequal funding that's just built into the system continues to exist, but new funding gets treated better. This is not rocket science. This is not having to look at 50 different options, try them all out and figure which one might be best. We know what's best. What's best is a full fair funding formula that applies to all education funding. We also need to address some of the mistakes of our charter school system and how that's pulling away from the other public school systems in ways it was not designed to do. And if I can, one last thing that I have always thought would benefit Pennsylvania with respect to education and our budget. We as legislators should not be voting on the education component of our state budget, and we certainly shouldn't be doing it annually. A lot of legislatures vote on a budget prospectively, 3 years out. They do it based on, a lot of sort of guesstimates and estimates. And as that time grows closer and closer and closer, they're reevaluated to make sure that that budget is a living document that can be applied. But we don't do it suddenly for the year right after a budget is implemented. And they remove components like education funding from the discretionary budget that legislatures fight about. Republicans and Democrats and the makeup of Republicans and Democrats in the legislature should also not impact whether a kid in Carbon County or Philadelphia get a good education, a good public education.
Okay, so this next line of questioning is going to seem disjointed, especially when we consider we've just been talking about education. But it is near and dear to the heart of Lieutenant Governor Fetterman, and that is passage of decriminalization and legalization of cannabis. He's toured the state. He's gone to all 67 Pennsylvania counties. He's done the research, Governor. The overwhelming consensus is we need radical change in Harrisburg that would bring us legalized cannabis and would wipe clean the criminal records of people who've been jailed for low-level, nonviolent cannabis offenses. What's your take on all of this? And should I start talking up now or wait until after you're inaugurated?
I'm going to answer this in reverse because you really ended with what I consider to be the most important component of that is that the only way that we're going to be able to move on recreational marijuana use is by addressing the sort of obtuse and the racist criminalization of marijuana leading up to this point. You said it, nonviolent, low level. We have to make sure that the people that have been harmed the most by the war on drugs aren't suddenly sitting in jails while watching people that look a lot like you and I make a bunch of money from a shop that looks like a Sephora down the street, right? And that's the way that's the way that we have to lead on this. There is a moral imperative as we legalize marijuana to make sure that we begin to, in all the ways we can, undo the wrongs of a classist, racist criminal justice system, especially as it dealt with the war on drugs. But yeah, this state wants legalized marijuana. It does. And we are a state that believes deeply in individual liberties. We are a state that believes in the rights and responsibilities of adulthood. We are a state that should believe in data and science and medicine, which all that all support full legalization. If what we were seeing in other states that had experimented with full legalization was somehow a heft of people falling on the social safety net with a criminal justice system, then we would be directing this differently. But that's not the case. It seems silly to say in public policy the proof is in the pudding, but the proof is in the pudding.
Along with the cannabis, now down in Virginia, the Commonwealth of Virginia just recently implemented some new regulations regarding cannabis, and the National Cannabis Party has come right out and said that those sound like an equitable measure on a temporary basis. So what it amounts to is Virginia is going to allow for individuals to own up to, I think it's 8 plants, and they'll be able to grow and use the seeds, the stems, the flowers, whatever part of the plant they want for medical reasons, while their dispensaries and producer licenses are being distributed by the Commonwealth. So is this a tact that Pennsylvania could take? Maybe we learn a lesson out of Virginia's playbook, or is this something that we should probably delegate to the legislature?
Well, as you can imagine, I have a lot of concerns about delegating things to the legislature for the legislature to discuss further. It's the first time hearing about it. It seems like a creative, novel approach. I'd like to know more. I don't inherently have any concerns with individuals growing marijuana in their own homes. It's a plant. And if I'm gonna trust Johnson and Johnson to grow it and sell it to a store to sell it to me, and then I don't know. I don't have an inherent concern with people with growing a marijuana plant in their own house. What I want to make sure is that if we do legalize this, that we do it with equity, that everybody has access in equal ways, and that we're making sure that the state isn't standing in the way of people in their personal liberties or their personal responsibilities.
Wow, that is refreshing to hear. What then is your, I know you have a list, everybody running for office has a list of pet projects they would like to see accomplished when they take over, when they become elected. What is towards the top of your pet project list?
There are two. One is that, that as we discussed earlier, Pennsylvania still does not have LGBT inclusive non-discrimination. In my 2-hour drive from my home in Philadelphia to the Capitol, I drive in and out of zones where I have equal rights 4 different times, depending on where I get gas or where my car breaks down, both of which have happened. I'm either an equal citizen in a state where I've been in the legislature for 10 years or I'm not. And I think there are a lot of different reasons for it, but I think that the state would benefit a lot from an aggressive top-down strategy of collaboration, bringing the 4 corners of this state together with respect to LGBTQ advocacy. One of the things that I've learned as a candidate that I have seen play out over the last 10 years is that far too often the political powers of this state pretend that there are just 2 cities in this state or just 2 counties in this state, and do so every single time to the detriment of all of us. If the answer to inequality in Pennsylvania was in Philadelphia or Pittsburgh, we'd have it already. The answer is everywhere else. And when we refuse or ignore or don't engage with the rest of this state who is right on equality, then we're just hurting ourselves and we're continuing this pattern that's gotten us to this point. And so that's one of them. The second has to do with one of the job duties of the lieutenant governor, and that's to chair the board of pardons. One of the things that we know about pardons is that when more people know about them, when more people have access to applications to them, more of them are granted. We need to, and we've seen a lot of this under Lieutenant Governor Fetterman, who I think has ramped up the pardons process more than any lieutenant governor in modern history. But it's a simple matter of resources in gets good quality out. I would like to spend as much time, resources, energy as I can to increase the resources of the Board of Pardons, because we know when it has more resources, when it does more work, it does more good.
There was a time back in 2013 that you came down the steps of the Capitol in Harrisburg, and I happened to be hosting a small get-together of friends of mine who were fighting for marriage equality. You might recall that. And then my friends and I took our signs and our banners and we marched across the steps, and everybody cheered and applauded and made a scene. And then we went on with our lives. And eventually in 2014, marriage equality became law. So could you reflect back on those times? What were some of the most difficult struggles you faced as a legislator in pushing for marriage equality to become law?
You know, I actually do reflect upon this a lot. I think often about, you know, the sort of arc of history with respect to LGBTQ civil rights. And, you know, I having been a legislator now for 10 years and my time in the legislature predating marriage equality, you know, Harvey Milk was assassinated 2 months after I was born. And I do think about how and where and why we've been fighting for so long for these rights. When I think about marriage equality, you know, when that decision came down, I believe it was in June, we were debating the budget. And I went up to the Speaker of the House, his name was Sam Smith at the time. And I said, "Sir, I would like to speak on the floor today about this Supreme Court decision that just came down." And he looked at me, and he was a Republican, and he was a good guy, and he hemmed and he hawed, and he goes, "Oh, you know, I just don't." I'm like, "Sir, this is the most important civil rights ruling of my lifetime. And this is the floor of the House of Representatives. And I'm going to talk about this here." Now, the way that works, for those that don't know, is that legislators on the floor either speak directly about a bill or they stand to speak essentially with the support of the room on anything. People get up and talk about the Kiwani's Club in their district or their anniversary. And it's just a regular thing, a part of the regular flow of the floor. And you either go up to a microphone and they call on you, or you go stand in the front of the room and use that microphone. So I went to a microphone and they eventually called on me and I said, "Mr. Speaker, today I rise to acknowledge the Supreme Court's decision," and my mic was cut. And, you know, it was among the first times I'd ever spoken on the House floor. And you could tell that there's video of it. You can tell I kind of didn't know what was going on at first. I messed with the microphone. It's old. I thought I broke it. And my colleagues around me did know what was going on. What they knew is that the speaker, the one who had just acknowledged me, has a kill switch and has the only master kill switch on the floor. He controls every mic, and that he had cut me off. When one of them realized, one of my other colleagues popped up and was sort of like, knew what was going on. "Mr. Speaker, I rise to acknowledge the Supreme Court." He got cut off. And then another woman rose and she got cut off. And really quickly, sort of bedlam broke out on the floor. I was new to the floor. It sort of directly involved me. It was really uncomfortable. I was husked down to sort of leadership. And ultimately what came of it is that what we were told is that a member had objected to me speaking and that they were going to rule for that member, but also weren't going to identify who it was. And that I just had to stop speaking because somebody wanted me to stop speaking. Ultimately, that wasn't good enough. There was a melee back and forth, and Daryl Metcalf got up from his chair and was like, "You want to know who it was? It was me." And he walked out of the room, and session was over that day. And it had a backlash that they could never have expected. In the day that followed, all of my colleagues asked me what I wanted to do. Do we want to get up there and give speeches? We'll all give speeches about marriage equality. And I said, "No. Reach out to every Republican that you think you have a good relationship with and ask them to sign under the non-discrimination bill." Like, I don't need a speech on the floor of many of these people. I don't need them to stand with me. I need them to stand with LGBTQ people on legislation. Do something overt, not just something easy. And I think, you know, in those weeks, more Republicans got off of the anti-LGBTQ bills than at any time in the years before that. More Democrats, and finally, eventually, the entire Democratic caucus signed on to those bills. But it was directly a result of trying to speak about marriage equality when we got the marriage equality ruling.
Well, that I think is a fantastic recap of the events from back then. And full disclosure, our organization is working on producing a film, a documentary about marriage equality and its changes to the United States between 1971 and 2021. So going all the way back to the Baker v. Nelson case in the 70s, through the time of the AIDS HIV crisis, passing through all the way up through the decisions from Hawaii and Vermont that brought about civil unions, and then to Vermont Governor Howard Dean and his big yeehaw moment, all the way past the Windsor case, and then Obergefell, and then events that have happened since then. And so your recollection of history, I recall seeing that on PCN, and it was touching. It was almost heart-wrenching to watch that pandemonium break out. Which leads to my final question for today's show, and that is, what was it like sitting next to Daryl Metcalf in the state government meetings?
It was a lot of things. For those that don't know, Daryl Metcalf is the the most racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, xenophobic bigot that has served in Pennsylvania government in the modern era. He has attacked overtly and covertly virtually every single human being in this state that is not exactly like him, and has been very powerful over the years in doing it. He is no longer powerful at all, and that's a kind of a result of all of this. He was the chair of what was called the State Government Committee, the committee that oversees election laws, civil rights, and I started serving on it my freshman year. And there were days that it made me very angry, but mostly, David, when I think about it, I think that it helped to form the advocate that I am now. In my career, I had never come up against somebody like him. I'd never had a nemesis before. I'd never had anybody that tried so hard to both hurt me individually and to attack all the things that I care about and the people that I care about professionally. And I learned a lot. I learned that you can't make everybody like you, that not everybody wants to be your friend. Not everybody's going to agree with you, but some people need to fear you. Darryl Metcalf is a shell of the person that he used to be, a shell of the legislator that he used to be. We neutered him by exposing him, by giving him enough rope to just continue every single time to like hang himself out to dry. He is a bad person with racist politics, sexist politics, transphobic politics. And it has impacted him in every way in his career. He was eventually moved out of that committee. He was moved to another committee where he got to do a lot of harm. And now he's not even coming back to the legislature. And to be able to watch these last several years as any modicum of respect or power that he might have had was pulled away from him was reassuring that those kinds of things do catch up with the true heinous bad actors of the era.
Brian, it has been a pleasure, an honor to have you on our show today. It really has. In season 1, I had the opportunity to speak with your colleague, Mike Schlossberg. So please give Mike my regards and let him know that you've been on the show now, and see if he tries to outdo you.
I will for sure. And David, thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. And that brings to a close another episode of PEP Talks Uncut. We'll be back next week when our special guest will be Senator Dalen Leach. We're looking forward to hearing from him and what the stalwart lion from the mid-2010s had to say about all kinds of issues. Until then, take care and thank you for tuning in.